We reviewed the PREOXI trial in episode 86. That was the randomized controlled multi-center in-hospital trial of non-invasive ventilation versus mask oxygenation prior to intubation. Now, it found 9% more peri-intubation hypoxemia with an oxygen mask for Preox compared with non-invasive ventilation. Now, as I mentioned in episode 86, that paper was practice affirming for me because I had long ago adopted a universal DSI for all of my intubations outside of cardiac arrest. I did it in my ED practice and in my EMS practice. Now, I said DSI. Well, what I meant by DSI is actually a bundle of care. It's a protocol that requires ketamine to be given to allow for optimum patient positioning and forming a tight mask seal with a BVM and PEEP over a nasal cannula, specifically for preoxygenation. And we found implementing this approach was associated with a 40% absolute reduction in the rate of peri-intubation hypoxia in our system at Williamson County at the time. Now, I have to admit, I felt like the way we were using a BVM, PEEP, and a nasal cannula, with proper positioning and ketamine sedation, but without giving manual breaths, I felt like that was non-invasive ventilation. And I felt like it was a poor man's CPAP and thought our results were confirmed by PREOXI. However, after reading a recent paper, I started to ask myself, what the hell non-invasive ventilation really means? And after a lot of thought, I've concluded that words matter. Definitions are definitional, and we absolutely must read beyond the abstract. Now, when we come back, I want to talk about this paper because I think it might be misunderstood. Now, certainly I misunderstood it, and I think other people may, and I want to make sure that we all know what we know about preoxygenation.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, the one where we shine the bright light of science on the darkness of current clinical practice. Now, as I was reviewing the table of contents of this month's journals, looking for a paper for this episode, I saw two titles that caught my eye, and after reading them, it reminded me that I have been meaning to talk about how I consume scientific literature. Why? Well, primarily because I get asked all the time how I pick papers for this podcast and how to figure out which papers I want to read. So first, I scan the table of contents for my favorite journals, and those are typically Pre-Hospital Emergency Care, Annals of Emergency Medicine, JSAP Open, Resuscitation, and then every once in a while I'll get some ticklers from JAMA or New England Journal, maybe Resus. But those are the key ones. And let's just take a look at the table of contents from the Articles in Press section of Annals of Emergency Medicine. That's today, as of the 16th of August, 2025, anyway. So we're going to use this as an example. Now, skimming down this list, I see the first paper is Managing Angioedema. Well, this is great. This is an interesting concept, but it's a review article, and it's not really what I talk about on this podcast. Next up, we have out-of-hospital use of Valsalva assist device for the treatment of SVT. Now, that one looks good. It's promising. It's a study, and studies are what I try to focus on in this podcast. Now, I'm kind of wondering if this assist device thing, if this is that modified blow in a syringe and lift the legs up thing that almost never works for me. It sounds interesting. So there's enough in the title for me to move on to the abstract and take a quick look in the paper for any pictures. And so when I open it up, yeah, it turns out it's pretty much that leg lift blow into the thingy. Now, it seems to work for them in that paper about as well as it does for me, which is to say, not very well. So I decided to move on past it. Although I have to say, I argue with Dr. Kupis about this all the time, and there are very few things I like more than a good argument with Dr. Kupis. Doug's a great friend, and I really enjoy arguing with him. So maybe, just maybe, I might come back to this one and do it as a "see, I told you so" kind of episode. But not for today. Let's keep going through the table of contents. Next one up, blood cultures. No, you lost me. No blood culture papers. We have one on synthetic opioids. Yeah, I'm just not feeling it. We got enough opioids. We're trying to use fewer of them. I'm sure it's a great paper, but not for me. And then we have this gem, comparison of pre-oxygenation strategies for intubation. Oh, hell yes. You have set the hook for me. I am definitely reading this one. But let's just see if there's something else. I'm going to keep scrolling a little bit. And I go down and I see another paper. This one is association of two pre-oxygenation approaches with hypoxemia during intubation, a secondary analysis. Now, this also looks perfect for me, and it seems to pair nicely with that other tile. Now, y'all know I'm an airway nerd. I can't think of a better way to spend a weekend than reading these papers and writing and recording a podcast on cool airway papers. Now, I know y'all hear that and you're like, Jeff, I can't either. This is just a perfect weekend for me. God knows I'd rather not be, say, on a cruise ship somewhere. We wouldn't want to do that. So we finished skimming the table of contents. We've looked for titles that might be interesting. Now we read the abstracts and see if we're really interested. Now, that first title about comparing Preox strategies, it's from Dr. Michael Gottlieb. And it turns out there really isn't an abstract to review because it's part of a series Annals runs. They run these things as short 2-pagers, and I love this series. It's called Systematic Review Snapshots, and it's a great series. Highly recommend it. They do a systematic review to answer a specific clinical question, and then they write up what is essentially a too long didn't read summary. It is perfect for those of us with typical emergency medicine attention spans. So instead of an abstract, it just has a single sentence take-home message. And man, did they get this right. So I'm just going to read it. It's just one sentence after all. When compared with face mask oxygenation, non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, and high-flow nasal cannula reduce the risk of hypoxemia during tracheal intubation of critically ill adults. Love it. Love it. That's it right there. It's to the point, confirms my understanding of the literature. Cannot love this enough. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We're going to move on now. What's that you say? You really want some numbers? You're a nerd listening to a nerdy podcast. You want the full meal deal? You bet. Here we go. Sorry, didn't mean to offend. What did they find? They found 53% lower relative risk of peri-intubation hypoxemia when using non-invasive ventilation compared with face mask. Now, the largest source of patients here was the PREOXI trial, so it's probably not surprising that it found, just like the PREOXI trial did, that non-invasive ventilation was better. Okay, on to the second abstract. This one says they did a secondary analysis of the PREOXI and device trials. What? To compare the rates of hypoxemia with BVM and face mask? That seems weird. And they found no difference. What? I don't understand what they're doing. This is not at all what I expected. And on its face, it kind of seems like they're using two distinct RCTs. One that directly randomized pre-oxygenation strategies, and one that completely ignored pre-oxygenation strategies and instead randomized direct laryngoscopy to video laryngoscopy. It seems to me that they're trying to use the results of those two distinct trials to come up with an answer to the same question that one of the trials already explicitly answered. And then they come up with a completely counterintuitive answer. This just confused the hell out of me. My initial conclusion on reading this abstract, to try to determine whether I was going to invest some time in reading the full paper, my initial conclusion was just immediately discount the findings and move on. Why? Well, because I thought they used what was honestly stupid and inappropriate methodology. But wait, as they say, there's more. Turns out there is an entire paper that fully explains what they did. Perhaps I should read it before I completely dismiss it. Perhaps with just a little bit of arrogance. Maybe I should RTFM, read the effing manuscript. So I did. I read it 2 or 3 times, in fact, and then I reread both PREOXI and device trials again. Now that would be episodes 86 and 75, respectively, just in case you're wondering. Not that I would ever plug prior episodes of this podcast or anything. Available in your podcast app and on YouTube, just in case you're wondering. Now, after rereading this paper a few times, and again rereading PREOXI and device, I finally figured out what they were doing. And I wanted to review this paper because it really reminded me to think hard before dismissing something that has gone through peer review, particularly at a journal known for taking methodology seriously. And I'm looking at you, Annals of Emergency Medicine. Seriously, guys, if you try to get something published at Annals, just expect a methodology colonoscopy. They really take this shit seriously. And just to be clear, I say that as a compliment. I've learned a lot from getting my colonoscopy from them. Now, you have been listening to this podcast over the last couple of episodes. You know that I've been trying to think like a Bayesian. I'm trying to take Oliver Cromwell's advice to heart. That advice that he gave to the Scots in his letter, he said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, please consider the possibility that you might be mistaken." So I'm trying to be a better man, a better doctor, a better scientist and researcher. I'm trying to take his advice and consider the possibility that I might be mistaken. Well, I'm glad I did, because it turns out I was mistaken. So on to the paper. Title? The title is Association of Two Preoxygenation Approaches with Hypoxemia During Tracheal Intubation, a Secondary Analysis. Now, it's in press now at Annals of Emergency Medicine. The lead author is Dr. Christopher Chou, and the senior author is Dr. Kevin Gibbs. Now, I don't know either of these authors, never met them. I didn't think I'd read anything they had written before, but to be honest, the name Kevin Gibbs kind of sounded a little familiar to me. I don't know him, but I opened up my Zotero library just to see if I'd read anything he's written before. And okay, now this is kind of embarrassing because it turns out I had, like today, turns out he was the lead author on the PREOXI trial. Oops. So I'm guessing we can probably assume he knows something about that trial. And then to make matters worse, I saw that he was an author on the device trial. So maybe, just maybe, I should not quite be so arrogant. Because I'm kind of thinking this information would have been nice to know about 45 minutes ago before I started getting all arrogantly dismissive. Oliver Cromwell, Bowels of Christ, etc., possibility I might be mistaken. One more reason I need to be better about this. Now, as the title of this paper suggests, it was a secondary analysis of the data from both of these RCTs. So as a reminder, PREOXI, it was a multi-center randomized control trial of patients in the ED and ICU who were undergoing RSI. It randomized adults to get 3 minutes of preoxygenation with either non-invasive ventilation or face mask, and they found a 9% peri-intubation hypoxemia rate with non-invasive ventilation compared to an 18.5% rate with the face mask group. Now, that was statistically significant, and I think clinically significant. It was a 9.4% absolute difference in, or at least so I thought, a difference in exactly the secondary analysis that we're looking at right now. So I thought PREOXI already answered the question that we're trying to answer now. Now, the device trial, that was also a multi-center ED ICU trial. It randomized patients to be intubated using either direct laryngoscopy or video laryngoscopy. Now, they found 85% first pass success with VL and 71 with DL, and that was a statistically significant 14% difference. 85% with VL. Does that seem low to y'all? Well, if it does, it's because they used a definition of success that's a little bit different than what most of us might be familiar with. The definition they used was 1 attempt at laryngoscopy and tube passage. So if the blade goes in and you make 2 attempts at putting a bougie or a tube through, and then you're successful, not a first pass success. So if you want to know more about this, go back to episode 74 because I talk about a paper that Dr. Trent did explaining the difference in definitions. So device left all other care to the treating physician's discretion, including, importantly here, the method of providing preoxygenation. And this is really where my cognitive dissonance comes in. It seems like they were combining, seems to me anyway, like they were combining an RCT of preoxygenation strategies with an RCT that completely ignored preoxygenation strategies, had nothing to do with it. And they were trying to answer a question, the exact same question that one of the trials had already answered. It just seemed wrong to me. So after very carefully reading all 3 papers again, I realized that when they talked about non-invasive ventilation, they didn't mean what I thought they meant. So let's get back to that. My ED preoxygenation practice is to use DSI with a ventilator-based bilevel device over nasal cannula with everything at the max oxygen flow. This is what these authors meant when they talked about non-invasive ventilation, plus or minus the DSI part. Now, my EMS practice is very similar, but at least at the time we started this practice, our crews didn't have ventilators that had BiPAP mode. So we approximated it with a poor man's alternative. We used a BVM with PEEP over a nasal cannula, forming a tight seal using a 2-handed grip and no assisted ventilation, as long as the patient continued to spontaneously breathe with adequate tidal volume. Now, we got results similar to what was found in PREOXI with improvement over face mask approach. In fact, we found a 40% decrease in peri-intubation hypoxemia. Now, because of this experience, I consider this the only way that anyone would ever even think about using a BVM. It honestly never occurred to me that anybody would just hold a BVM over someone's face, because that just seems kind of like blow-by oxygen to me, and that's not what we're trying to achieve here. But it turns out with this, and perhaps many other things, my experience isn't universal. When you read PREOXI with this distinction in mind, they explicitly say that BVM was considered a face mask strategy and not a non-invasive ventilation strategy. Like I said to begin with, it turns out that words matter and definitions are definitional. I apparently was not speaking the same language as the authors. I was not using the same words the authors were. I was not using the same definitions the authors were using. I had a completely different idea of what using BVM for ventilations was. I considered it non-invasive and they didn't. Important distinction. In the PREOXI trial, when a patient was randomized to the face mask group, they may have received a non-rebreather mask, like I assumed, or they might have received a bag valve mask in what I would essentially call blow-by mode, and which one they got was at the discretion of the treating physician, meaning it was not randomized, and that makes all the difference in the world. Now, as it turns out, the type of preoxygenation device being used was recorded in the device trial, even if it wasn't in the manuscript or what the manuscript was about. Now things are making more sense to me. I can see how combining these two data sets makes sense because neither one of them randomized patients to BVM or face mask, because if they had, you wouldn't need to do this trial at all. Now, with that mystery cleared up, let's dive deeper into the paper. Now, although the treatment being randomized was different in the two studies, both of the populations were very similar. Adults in either an ICU or an ED who needed intubation for critical illness. And in both studies, the majority of the intubations were done by a resident physician or a fellow, and almost all of the intubations were done with RSI, just so you have a comparison to what you may be doing. They took the group randomized to face mask in the PREOXI trial, and then they added in all of the patients from the device trial. Now, the exposure here was either BVM or face mask. There was no non-invasive ventilation included at all. Now, unfortunately, they don't have any information about whether they used PEEP when they used a BVM. And that's unfortunate, but it's not what they're studying, so I understand why they didn't record it. At least it's not what they were studying in the device trial. So that's their exposure. The primary outcome, that was peri-intubation hypoxemia, and they define that as an SpO2 under 85 at any point between induction of anesthesia and 2 minutes following intubation. All right. Now for the statistical nerdery. You didn't think we were going to skip out on that because it's a nerdy podcast. You need to get your time's worth here. You need your nerdery. So what did they do? They used propensity-weighted regression. Now think of that like regular multivariable logistic regression, but with an extra twist. Each patient gets a weight or a score based on how likely they were, given their characteristics, to get either BVM or face mask. And then they added that into the regression. It's just one of the ways they were trying to account for indication bias. Indication bias is the idea that the patients who got a BVM might have been systematically different in some important ways from the ones who got just a face mask. Indication bias is important, and it's important to address here because, in my opinion, it almost certainly exists, at least to some degree, in this study. What do I mean? Well, perhaps, just perhaps, hear me out, patients who got a BVM were felt by the treating clinician to be in some way more likely to need assisted ventilation, which you can do with a BVM but not a face mask. And just to be ready, just in case, then they decided to use the BVM as a face mask. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. And because the choice was at the physician's discretion and they didn't record why, we're never going to be able to know about any of this or other unidentified confounders. Now, that's just a limitation of all non-randomized trials. I'm not trying to beat this one up. All non-randomized trials have this problem, and their model is a pretty reasonable way to try to mitigate this indication bias. As a matter of fact, they could have just done a logistic regression, and they added in the propensity weighting to try to go one step further to address it. Now, I mentioned this was a non-randomized trial. Why do I say that? Even though these two trials, where the data comes from, they were RCTs. Well, the patients in those studies were not randomized into the groups that this paper is studying. They're randomized for different reasons. So this is really still an observational trial, but it is one that has the benefit of the data being collected for research purposes, being carefully defined and prospectively collected. And that data quality is important so that we know how much credibility we should give the results. And I think we should give the results more credibility because of that. So what did they end up with? Well, it turns out there were 148 patients in the BVM group and 1,077 in the face mask group. There just weren't many people getting Preox with the BVM, and that really suggests to me that there was something different about these patients. Now, they had to exclude a couple of patients from each group because of missing data, and they ended up with 136 in the BVM group and 1,020 in the mask group. Baseline characteristics were essentially the same, except for a couple of differences, and those might be important, so we ought to talk about them. There were more ED patients who had face mask ventilation, and there were more ICU patients who had BVM ventilation, or BVM oxygenation, I should say. And there were slightly more BVM patients who were on pressors, and there were slightly more patients in the face mask group who had a full 3 minutes of pre-oxygenation time. Now, if those differences were significant, we probably ought to think about how they might impact the results. So, if there are more patients with BVM that were on pressors, maybe the BVM group was sicker. Seems reasonable. And if that's the case, we would expect that group to maybe be more likely to have peri-intubation hypoxemia. And if more patients in the face mask group had a full 3 minutes of denitrogenation, of pre-oxygenation, they might be better prepared to ward off desaturation. So if that's the case, we would expect the BVM group to do worse and the face mask group to do better, maybe enough so that it negates any potential benefit of BVM that might be there. Maybe. We don't know. We can't know unless we do an RCT on this. Their adjusted analysis gives some indication that this wasn't a factor because it finds the same thing. But still, we really need an RCT to do this. But it turns out I don't think there's any point in doing an RCT on this because we already know what the right way to do it is. But I'm going to get back to that in just a second. Let's get to the bottom line results first. Peri-intubation hypoxemia was present in 14.7% of the BVM patients, compared with 15% with face mask, and that is obviously the same damn number, no statistical difference. Now, the adjusted analysis showed an adjusted odds ratio with BVM compared to face mask of 1.22 with a 97% confidence interval, going from 0.72 to 2.16. That interval crosses 1, therefore not statistically significant. That also means that if the study were repeated 100 times, we would expect to get an answer in that range 95% of the times. Remember that frequentist statistics is all about how often you would see similar results in similar tests, and that's where the term frequentist comes from. So they did have several secondary analyses, but none of those are any different than their primary outcome. And honestly, they're not interesting enough for us to really talk about. So let's move on. Once I understood what they were doing and how BVM was being used, I guess it really isn't surprising to me that they saw no difference. Now, I say this because even though I didn't think about it, now that I am remembering back, I do work in an ED and I see how poorly almost everybody uses a BVM. Now, I'm not pointing fingers here. I truly mean everyone. I mean doctors. I mean nurses. I mean respiratory therapists, paramedics, techs. Hell, I mean the janitor who happened to just be walking by and somebody put a BVM in their hands. I mean everybody does this poorly. And I'm not talking to you, anesthesia. Run along, go do your anesthesia things. You're not part of this conversation. I'm sure you do it fine. We don't. Now, along with the BVM, It's important to say that we don't know if they're using PEEP. We don't know if they're properly positioning the patient. We don't know if they're getting a good seal. We don't know that because that's not what they were studying at the time they collected the data. Based on my experience as somebody who is obsessed with forming a good seal and using BVMs appropriately, I'm guessing that many, if not most, of the BVMs in this study, they were held sort of loosely, generally in the vicinity of the face, rather than forming a tight seal using a two-handed grip, lifting the mandible up into the mask instead of pushing the mask down onto the mandible. And if I'm right about this, then the BVM group was really just getting blow by oxygen by another route, probably pretty similar to the face mask group, and therefore it shouldn't be surprising that they got similar results. So that's my take on the paper, but I think maybe a more important question is what should we do with this information? Now I can answer that in a strictly science-based way based only on what the literature tells us, or I can answer it in a pragmatic way. The science-based argument, limiting yourself only to what the science shows, is that there are some patients who won't desat for 3 to 5 to 7 minutes, even if you don't do Preox at all, and hell, even if you stick a pillow over their face. In these patients, it doesn't really matter what you do to Preox, or even if you Preox them at all, because they're healthy and they're highly likely to not desaturate, at least in a reasonable amount of time. You might as well do what is convenient for you. And let's be honest, convenient for you is a non-rebreather mask. Now, my pragmatic, maybe just a little bit judgy answer is that we didn't go into medicine to do what is convenient for us. We went into medicine to do what is best for our patients. And in my mind, that means treating every patient like they will have both an anatomically and physiologically difficult airway. Go in with that assumption and you're not going to be surprised. Now, in my pragmatic and highly opinionated mind, that means universal DSI with proper positioning, video laryngoscopy use, a ventilator in BiPAP mode with SIMV capability so that it can begin assisting ventilations as the paralytic takes effect. It also means using high-flow apneic oxygenation with a nasal cannula throughout the duration of the intubation and assuring that you have SpO2s greater than or equal to 94% for at least 3 minutes, and of course, having good blood pressure. That's what I think is in the patient's best interest, and I think we should do it every single time. We often don't know when a patient is going to be a difficult airway right up until they announce it, when we're mucking around in their larynx, and it's now too late for us to properly plan. So that's my opinionated, pragmatic answer. And now that I understood what they were doing, I actually think this is a pretty decent paper. I think it is reasonable. It's got good methods. It's good paper. I still think it's answering a question that it never occurred to me to ask. I don't think we should be using either a BVM or a face mask, at least a BVM in blow-by mode. We know non-invasive ventilation provides better pre-oxygenation, so let's just use what works and what our patients deserve, because after all, it's about them and not us. It's not about what is convenient for us. It's about what's best for them. Now, with that last bit of preaching from atop my incredibly high horse, I get it, I'm opinionated, I think we've reached the end of this episode. This is episode 101, by the way. We just passed 100 episodes. Thank y'all for listening and helping us get to a place most podcasts don't get to. As always, thank you for listening, and thank you for taking care of your patients every day. Y'all literally hold the world of medicine together, and I appreciate what you do. I would love to hear from you about this. Drop me an email or hit me up on the socials. I'm rarely on that former Twitter thing, and I'm usually on the Threads or Blue Sky. Thanks again. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast. a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.